It was a moonless night, and the Night Flight 113 took off from Chicago bound for Atlanta, as usual. Captain Jack Harlow, a veteran pilot with over 20 years of experience, was in command, accompanied by his co-pilot, Lisa Monroe. The flight seemed promising, the sky was clear at takeoff, and forecasts indicated a smooth journey. However, as soon as they reached cruising altitude, everything started to change. An unexpected storm front appeared on the radar, and before they could alter their course, they were swallowed by a blanket of dark, thick clouds. Lightning flashed across the sky with alarming frequency, and the sound of thunder seemed to shake the very plane. Jack remained calm, adjusting the course to try and avoid the worst of the storm, but something was wrong. The stars, which normally served as a reference in the night sky, had completely vanished, and even the city lights below were invisible due to the density of the clouds. Suddenly, without warning, the navigation system began to fail. The panel lights flickered, and the instruments that had always been reliable began to show contradictory readings. The compass spun out of control, and the altimeter seemed stuck, indicating a fixed altitude, even though Jack knew they were rising and falling with the air currents. Lisa tried to recalibrate the systems, but each attempt was thwarted by continuous failures and alert signals popping up on the panel. The tension inside the cockpit escalated. Without the stars or city lights as a reference, they were practically blind. Jack and Lisa had to rely on their instincts and basic flight training, something they hadn't needed to do in years. With each passing minute, the storm seemed to intensify, as if it were pulling them into its core. The plane shook violently, and the sound of the rain hitting the metal fuselage was almost deafening. Lisa began reviewing the manual navigation maps, desperately trying to find some reference that could help them orient themselves. That's when she noticed something that made her heart stop for a moment. The coordinates indicated that they were approaching an area known as the Triangle of the Vanished, a notorious zone for reports of aircraft disappearing without a trace. The mention of the triangle was enough to heighten the fear. They had both heard stories about the area, but had always treated them as legends, something to talk about in bars after a long flight, not as a real threat. Jack tried to remain calm, but the failure of the navigation systems, combined with a storm that seemed increasingly abnormal, began to affect his confidence. He knew he had to make a quick decision. With the instruments failing one by one and the sense that something else was wrong, panic began to creep into the cockpit. The passenger's safety depended on his ability to pilot the plane almost blindly, relying only on his instincts. When Lisa mentioned the name the Triangle of the Vanished, a sense of terror took over the cockpit. Jack tried to push the fear away, but the mention of that place brought to mind all the stories he had heard over the years. Stories of planes that disappeared without a trace, of experienced pilots who communicated for the last time only to disappear from the radar shortly afterward. The legend said that the area was a vortex of unknown forces, where the laws of physics and logic didn't apply. As they approached the coordinates, the instruments began to fail in an even stranger way. The speedometer fluctuated, alternating between absurdly high and dangerously low speeds, while the artificial horizon spun continuously, as if the plane were in constant rotation. The radio, previously noisy with the static sound of the storm, now emitted distorted and fragmented voices. They were words that made no sense, spoken in cold and mechanical tones, almost as if they were some kind of code. Lisa, now in a panic, desperately tried to adjust the systems, but each attempt was in vain. Jack, on the other hand, struggled with the feeling of losing control. He had faced storms before, flown in much worse conditions, but had never felt the plane behave so erratically. With each passing second, the idea that something beyond his understanding was happening became harder to ignore. Suddenly, the voices on the radio intensified, becoming louder and clearer, but still completely indecipherable. They didn't come from any control tower or another plane. It was as if they were being transmitted directly from the very air around them. The words seemed entangled in an ancient code, a forgotten language that neither of them could comprehend. The voices didn't seem human, and the way they oscillated between high and low tones was disturbing, as if something were trying to communicate but without the intention of being understood. As the plane continued to lose altitude, Jack forced himself to stay calm. He knew he needed to find a way out of the situation, but each passing second brought him closer to what he feared. The feeling of being pulled by invisible forces was inescapable, and the lack of control over the situation only amplified the terror he felt. Lisa, now nearly in tears, begged Jack to do something, anything, but their options were quickly running out. Then, amid the chaos, something strange appeared on the navigation panel. A tiny light, almost imperceptible, began to flash on the digital map, indicating an unknown airport nearby. Jack and Lisa exchanged looks, unsure if it was an error from the already failing systems or a last chance for survival. They decided that, with everything else failing, they had no choice but to follow that light. It might be an illusion, maybe a trap, but it was the only hope they had. The plane continued to descend, and the systems, now completely out of control, offered no help. Jack had to rely on his instincts and experience, manually adjusting the controls and hoping that the point on the map was real. As they approached the indicated location, the plane began to stabilize slightly, as if being guided by an invisible force. The airport finally came into view, or at least, what seemed to be an airport. It was a small runway, barely lit, surrounded by darkness. There were no signs of life, no light indicating a control tower or any type of infrastructure. But at that moment, it was the only hope they had. The airport appeared like a mirage in the middle of total darkness, a thread of hope amid the chaos that dominated Flight 113. The small runway was dimly lit by weak and intermittent lights, flickering irregularly as if powered by a dying generator. There was no sign of movement, no communication from a control tower, nothing to indicate that the place was operational. However, for Jack and Lisa, that runway was the only chance they had of surviving this inexplicable situation. Jack forced himself to stay focused. With the navigation systems completely wrecked and the altitude rapidly dropping, he knew he would have to rely on his piloting skills to land the plane manually. Lisa, still in shock, did what she could to help, adjusting the few panel lights that still worked and maintaining a direct line with Jack, giving him the crucial information he needed. Approaching the runway, Jack reduced the plane's speed, feeling the air resistance as he fought to keep the aircraft level. The wind howled around the fuselage, and the plane shook violently with the storm's unpredictable gusts. The runway seemed to be moving, changing shape as they approached, but Jack dismissed this perception as another trick of his exhausted mind. When they finally touched the ground, the impact was hard. The plane shook violently, and for a moment, Jack feared the wheels might not withstand the pressure. But miraculously, the plane stabilized, and he managed to guide the aircraft along the runway toward what appeared to be a small hangar or parking area, where the lights finally went out completely. The silence that followed was almost deafening, starkly contrasting with the roar of the storm that still echoed in their ears. After a few moments to catch their breath and process what had just happened, Jack and Lisa prepared to evacuate the plane. They needed to check on the passengers, ensure everyone was safe, and find out exactly where they had landed. However, as soon as they opened the cockpit door, they were met by thick, oppressive darkness. The air was heavy, laden with almost suffocating humidity, and there was no sound except the distant dripping of water, as if everything around them was dead. Exploring the area with their emergency flashlights, Jack and Lisa soon realized that the airport was completely abandoned. The few structures that existed were in ruins, covered in vegetation and moss, as if they had been forgotten for decades. There were no vehicles, no signs of life, not even the typical sounds of nature. The feeling of isolation was overwhelming. That's when they noticed something even more disturbing. The marks on the runway, the same ones they had followed to land, seemed old, as if they had been made by other planes many years ago. And upon closer inspection, they noticed that their own plane's marks seemed to be fading, almost as if they were being erased before their eyes. The slow, terrible realization that what they had experienced wasn't just a common emergency began to set in. The airport wasn't an ordinary place. It was as if it existed outside of time, a sort of limbo where lost planes ended up. Jack and Lisa looked around, trying to understand what was happening, but the darkness seemed to swallow any trace of logic or reason. It was as if the place itself was alive, slowly absorbing them into its infinite void. With no other option, they began searching for an exit, a way to communicate with the outside world, but everything around suggested they were far beyond the reach of help. The radio, which had previously transmitted those distorted voices, was now completely silent, and their phones had no signal. They were trapped in an airport that shouldn't exist, surrounded by darkness that seemed to stretch on forever. The overwhelming sense that they would never leave there set in. What had started as a routine flight had turned into a never-ending nightmare. Jack and Lisa, now fully aware of the gravity of their situation, realized that what they had found wasn't just a forgotten place, but something much worse, a final destination for those who ventured into unknown areas and never returned. Flight MH17 departed from Singapore on a clear night, bound for Sydney. On board were 250 passengers, each with their own plans and destinations, all confident that they would arrive safely. Captain Ahmad Farid, an experienced pilot with more than 2 decades of service, was in command, accompanied by his trusted crew. Everything seemed calm, the takeoff was smooth, and the weather didn't indicate any problems. However, about 2 hours after takeoff, an alarm sounded in the cockpit. Initially, it seemed like a routine alert, something that could be easily resolved. But when Ahmad and the co-pilot began to investigate, they realized it was something much more serious. The hydraulic system was experiencing critical failures. This system was vital for controlling the plane, and any failure could lead to a catastrophic loss of control. As they tried to stabilize the situation, Ahmad and the co-pilot noticed that the problem was rapidly worsening. The readings on the panels began to fluctuate, and the flight controls responded irregularly. The alert system, which normally indicated isolated issues, started flashing like a Christmas light display, each alarm more urgent than the last. Ahmad knew that unless they could resolve the issue quickly, the flight could end in disaster. The cabin crew was informed of the problem, and the flight attendants began preparing for a possible emergency. They tried to keep the passengers calm, but the tension was palpable. Ahmad knew he needed to make a quick decision, so he initiated emergency procedures to deal with the hydraulic failure. However, what really surprised them was the smell. Shortly after the alarm went off, a strong and inexplicable odor began to spread through the cabin, a smell of something burning. The situation was deteriorating at an alarming rate. The smell soon became unbearable, increasing the panic among the passengers and crew. Ahmad and the co-pilot tried to locate the source of the smell, but couldn't find any signs of fire or smoke. It seemed as though the plane was being consumed by something invisible, something they couldn't control. With no communication with the control tower due to the electrical failure that accompanied the hydraulic issue, Ahmad realized he had to consider an emergency landing. With the strong smell of burning spreading rapidly, the cabin crew struggled to maintain order among the passengers. Some began to pray, others tried to call their loved ones, but the communication systems were also failing. Ahmad knew that the only remaining option was to attempt a landing on the ocean, an extremely risky maneuver that required absolute precision. However, with no contact with the control tower and the plane systems failing one by one, the chances of success were slim. As the plane lost altitude and the situation became more desperate, Ahmad noticed something strange in the clouds around them. While preparing the aircraft for impact, he saw what appeared to be the silhouette of another plane, very similar to MH17, emerging from the clouds. It was as if it were reflecting their own plane, but in an ethereal, almost translucent way. The crew and passengers also began to notice the strange vision, further heightening the sense of dread. As MH17 descended towards the ocean, the atmosphere inside the cabin grew increasingly tense. The smell of something burning continued to permeate the air, heightening the sense of panic among passengers and crew. In the cockpit, Ahmad and the co-pilot did everything they could to keep the aircraft stable, but the faulty systems made every maneuver an arduous task. Then, Ahmad saw something that defied all understanding. In the dense clouds surrounding the plane, a silhouette began to emerge. It wasn't a simple shadow or reflection, but the distinct shape of another plane, seemingly flying parallel to MH17. What left Ahmad perplexed was the appearance of the other plane. It looked almost identical to theirs, but in a nebulous form, as if it were made of smoke or mist. Its edges wavered, and the outline of the plane seemed to disintegrate and reform constantly, as if it were trapped in a state of transition. The co-pilot also noticed the strange apparition, and both were silent for a moment, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. Ahmad forced himself to look away, focusing on trying to control the descent, but the presence of the ghostly plane was undeniable. Then the radio, which had been silent since the electrical failure, began to emit a low hiss, followed by fragments of distorted communication. Ahmad and the co-pilot exchanged looks of disbelief. The radio was picking up something, but the voice was unrecognizable, as if it were coming from a great distance or another time. The translucent plane continued to fly alongside MH17, maintaining a constant distance. The most disturbing thing, however, was that it seemed to be guiding them, following a specific path through the clouds. Ahmad tried to alter the course, but MH17 seemed trapped in an invisible current, being pulled along the same route as the ghostly plane. The navigation panel, which was already practically unusable, began to display coordinates that Ahmad didn't recognize, as if the plane itself were receiving instructions from another source. As the plane descended, the strange vision persisted, and the voice on the radio began to become clearer, though still unintelligible. Ahmad realized that there was something familiar about the shape of the other plane, something he couldn't immediately identify. And then, everything made sense in a terrifying way. The plane he was seeing next to them was a perfect replica of a flight that had disappeared years ago under mysterious circumstances on the same route that MH17 was now following. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. They were following in the footsteps of a plane that never reached its destination. A plane that, according to records, simply disappeared from radar without a trace. It was as if they were doomed to repeat the same fate, drawn into a cycle of tragedy and disappearance that seemed to have no end. As MH17 neared the ocean, the translucent plane began to fade into the clouds, as if disintegrating back into the nothingness from which it had emerged. Ahmad and the co-pilot didn't have time to ponder what they had just witnessed. They had to focus on the impending landing. But the feeling that they were being guided to a predetermined fate by forces beyond their understanding was inescapable. The radio returned to silence, and the clouds around them parted to reveal the dark, choppy waters below. Ahmad knew they had only seconds to react. The panic among the passengers was palpable, but he did his best to stay calm as they prepared for impact. And in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the image of that ghost plane, knowing that somehow, he had witnessed a premonition of what could have happened, or what was yet to come. The impact of the landing on the ocean was brutal. MH17 hit the dark waters with a force that shook the entire aircraft, throwing passengers forward in their seats and generating a deafening roar. Ahmad fought with the controls until the last moment, trying to minimize the damage, but he knew that a water landing would never be smooth. The plane finally came to a stop, floating unsteadily on the choppy waves as the crew desperately tried to initiate the evacuation. The burning smell that had haunted the flight disappeared the instant they hit the water, replaced by the salty, humid air of the ocean. Ahmad and the co-pilot quickly began the evacuation procedures, releasing the lifeboats and guiding the passengers out of the aircraft. Chaos reigned inside the cabin, but the crew managed to maintain an appearance of order as the plane began to slowly sink. The passengers, many still in shock, were guided into the lifeboats. However, as they descended into the dark waters, the feeling of safety quickly dissipated. They were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by an endless expanse of water, with no sign of rescue in sight. The only light came from the full moon, casting a pale, cold glow over the scene, heightening the sense of desolation. That's when they began to notice the shadows in the waters around the boats. At first, they were just vague shapes, moving beneath the surface as if lurking. Some passengers, still paralyzed by fear, began to murmur about sea creatures or sharks. But it soon became clear that the shadows didn't belong to any known animal. They had humanoid forms, distorted and elongated, and seemed to observe the survivors with unsettling intelligence. Ahmad, floating in one of the lifeboats, watched the shadows with a chill down his spine. They didn't come too close but were always present, slowly circling the boats as if waiting for something. The survivors began to exchange fearful glances, whispering theories and prayers, trying to understand what was happening. But there were no answers, only the presence of these dark figures, which seemed to be part of the mystery that had begun with the ghost plane in the clouds. As the hours passed, the panic among the survivors began to grow. The shadows, initially distant, began to draw closer and closer, as if testing the limits, waiting for the right moment to act. Ahmad tried to maintain calm among the passengers, but he himself was overcome with terror. The figures in the water seemed to be in sync, moving together as a single fragmented entity. At one point, one of the shadows slightly emerged from the water, revealing a pale and deformed face, with empty eyes that seemed to pierce the soul of anyone who dared look at them. The survivors began to scream, panic spreading like wildfire. Some tried to row away, but the shadows continued to follow them, relentless. Ahmad realized that there was no way to escape. They were surrounded, trapped in a living nightmare. The figures in the waters weren't mere hallucinations. They were something much more real, and their presence was a harbinger that survival in the ocean would not be the only challenge. Finally, as the moon began to descend on the horizon, the shadows slowly retreated, returning to the depths from which they had emerged. But the peace that followed was fragile and disturbing. The survivors, now floating in deadly silence, knew that they had been spared for the moment, but the feeling that they were at the mercy of incomprehensible forces never left. Dawn brought the relief of an eventual rescue team, but for Ahmad and the others who had witnessed what lurked beneath the waters, the true horror wasn't in the plane crash, but in what had surfaced during that endless night. And as the lifeboats were pulled onto the rescue ship, the feeling that something was watching them from the depths never left their minds, like a shadow that refused to disappear. Benjamin Knox, a veteran pilot known for his skill in risky missions, was on a solitary route over the Arctic, transporting a load of sensitive scientific equipment. The mission, which was supposed to be a simple crossing from one point to another, quickly turned into a nightmare when, without any warning, one of the plane's engines suffered a critical failure. In the middle of polar airspace, with external temperatures dropping drastically, Ben found himself isolated, with a vast expanse of ice below and the freezing sky above. The engine failure was just the beginning of the problems. Within minutes, the extreme cold began to affect the aircraft's internal systems. The cabin, once heated, began to lose temperature rapidly, and Ben felt the icy air invade the space, creating vapor clouds with each breath. The control panels began to fail, with lights flickering and indicators literally freezing on the screens. Even more alarming, the communication system was the next to fail, cutting off Ben's connection to any external help. Total isolation became a brutal reality. The vast white landscape stretched out below, with no sign of life or civilization, just an endless expanse of ice and snow. Ben knew he had to stay calm, but the fear of being alone in one of the most inhospitable places on Earth was almost overwhelming. Without communication, without heating, and with the engine failure compromising his altitude, he was in a race against time and the cold. With each minute, the temperature dropped further, and Ben felt his fingers beginning to freeze on the controls. As he tried to find a solution, something strange began to happen. In the cargo hold, which should have been completely silent and inert, Ben started hearing sounds, small rhythmic thumps, as if something were moving inside. At first, he ignored it, thinking it could be the effect of ice on the stored materials. But the thumping continued, growing louder and more insistent until it became impossible to ignore. With the plane struggling to stay in the air, Ben was forced to leave the cockpit for a moment to check the cargo hold. When he opened the door, he was met with a blast of cold air that almost made him recoil. Inside, the sight he found was strangely disconcerting. Several of the boxes were covered by a thin layer of ice, which wasn't unexpected. But one of them, larger and marked with security seals, was trembling slightly, as if something inside were trying to get out. Ben felt a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the air temperature. As he approached the box, he realized that the thumping was coming from inside it. Something was alive in there, something that shouldn't be. Looking at the side of the box, he saw a label indicating experimental cryogenic specimens, a vague and, at that moment, incredibly disturbing term. The cargo, which he had assumed was just regular scientific equipment, was much more than that. The thumping inside the box became more frantic, as if the thing inside knew it was being watched. Ben felt panic begin to set in. He was trapped in a plane that was falling, alone in the frozen wilderness, and now with something unknown and potentially dangerous trying to escape its confinement. He needed to make a quick decision, but what should he do? Open the box and face whatever was inside? Or try to stay calm and continue fighting to keep the plane in the air? With the plane becoming increasingly unstable and the cold taking over the cabin, Ben Knox knew he had little time to act. The thumping coming from inside the box in the cargo hold was growing more insistent, as if something inside was waking up from a long sleep. Ben's mind raced as he tried to understand what was happening. Experimental cryogenic specimens, the phrase echoed in his head, laden with an implicit threat that he couldn't ignore. Struggling against the cold that froze his movements, Ben moved closer to the box. His hands trembled, not just from the intense cold but from the fear of what he might find. The boxes around were inert, covered in ice, but this one in particular seemed to vibrate with its own energy, as if the contents were coming to life. The security seal was intact, but the shaking was strong enough to crack the ice around the box. Ben looked around, trying to think of a solution. He knew that opening the box could be extremely dangerous, but ignoring it wasn't an option either. The thumping was becoming more violent, as if whatever was inside was fighting to get out. He grabbed a screwdriver from the emergency toolkit, determined to investigate. There wasn't much time to consider the consequences. The plane was falling, and any hesitation could be fatal. Taking a deep breath, Ben began to work on the box's seal. Each movement was slow and deliberate, as if any mistake could trigger something uncontrollable. The thumping continued, and the sense of urgency increased with each second. Finally, the seal gave way, and the box lid opened slightly, allowing a cold, dense air to escape, along with a metallic smell that Ben couldn't identify. Inside the box, shrouded in a thin mist, was a strange object with a texture that seemed to be made of intertwined flesh and metal. It wasn't a simple cryogenic specimen. It was something much more complex and disturbing. What Ben saw made him instinctively recoil. The thing inside the box seemed alive, pulsing with a cold energy, and moved erratically, as if it were trying to orient itself. Ben tried to stay calm, but the sight was too disturbing. There was no time to think. He knew he needed to get back to the cockpit and try to land the plane, but whatever was in the box seemed to pose an immediate danger. Suddenly, the thing inside the box began to emit a low sound, a sort of mechanical hum mixed with an organic gurgle, as if it were trying to communicate. With nerves on edge, Ben quickly closed the box, trying to block out the disturbing sound. He knew he had to keep it confined, at least until he could land the plane. But the situation was getting worse. The thumping returned, now stronger than before, making the box vibrate threateningly. The plane was shaking more and more, and Ben knew time was running out. He ran back to the cockpit, heart pounding and mind racing to process what he had just seen. The control panel was a mess, with lights flashing and alarms blaring in unison. Ben grabbed the controls, trying to stabilize the descent. The improvised ice runway he had identified on the maps was approaching, but the plane was behaving erratically, as if being pulled by forces beyond his control. The cargo hold behind him continued to echo with the thumping, and the sound seemed to grow, as if it were amplifying. Ben tried to ignore it, focusing all his attention on landing the plane, but the feeling that something was about to spiral out of control was overwhelming. He knew that somehow, the cargo he was carrying was connected to the chaos that was unfolding. With his heart pounding in his chest, Ben prepared for the hardest landing of his career. The plane was in full descent, and he could barely control the aircraft, which seemed to resist every command he gave. The improvised ice runway he had located was his only hope, a stretch of flat, seemingly firm ice, illuminated only by the aurora borealis shimmering in the Arctic sky. As the plane descended, the thumping in the cargo hold grew even more intense, as if something was desperately trying to escape. The sound was now almost deafening, reverberating through the cabin walls. Ben knew he couldn't afford to be distracted. He had to focus on the landing, even if the disturbing sound seemed to want to drive him away from that goal. Every second counted, and the plane was descending faster than he had planned. The ice runway approached rapidly, and Ben fought with the controls to align the aircraft. The ground seemed to shift beneath him, as if the ice itself were alive, undulating under the influence of the aurora borealis above. He knew the runway could be treacherous, one miscalculation, and the plane could split in half on impact. But there was no other option. Fuel was running low, and the weather conditions were worsening. When the plane finally touched the ice, the impact was violent. The wheels slid and skidded, and the plane shook as if being torn apart from within. Ben held firm on the controls, using all his skill to keep the plane straight as it slid along the runway. The sound of the thumping in the cargo hold grew in intensity, now accompanied by a sound that seemed like a wail, a high-pitched inhuman howl that made the hairs on the back of Ben's neck stand up. The plane finally stopped, skidding to an irregular halt, and for a moment, everything was silent. Ben took a deep breath, relieved that he had managed to land the aircraft without further incident. But the silence was brief. The thumping in the cargo box resumed, now more violent than ever, accompanied by a sound that seemed to be a mix of metal scraping and flesh being torn. Ben knew he could no longer ignore what was happening back there. Grabbing the emergency flashlight, he ran back to the cargo hold, determined to confront whatever was inside. Opening the door, the sight that awaited him was worse than he could have imagined. The box was practically destroyed, with pieces of metal scattered across the floor, and in the center, a being that defied any description he could give. It was a grotesque fusion of flesh and machine, pulsating and writhing as if in agony or rage, trying to completely free itself from its confinement. Ben froze for a moment, unable to comprehend how something like this could exist. But the thing inside the box didn't wait for his reaction. It moved with unexpected speed, advancing out of the box and crawling across the frozen floor of the cargo hold. The creature, despite its distorted appearance, was incredibly fast, and Ben felt terror surge up his spine as he realized that it was alive and aware. Time seemed to stretch as Ben struggled to think of what to do. He needed to escape the plane, but the creature was blocking the way. Then, he saw something that gave him a small glimmer of hope. At the back of the cargo hold, still intact, was a reserve fuel tank, normally used in extreme emergencies. He knew that a spark, any ignition, could be enough to blow the tank, but it was a risk he was willing to take. With a quick movement, Ben ran toward the tank, opening the valve and allowing the fuel to start spilling onto the frozen floor. The creature, noticing the movement, advanced towards him, but Ben was faster. Using the lighter he always carried in his pocket, he threw a spark onto the spilled fuel, which ignited instantly. The explosion was small but enough to create a barrier of flames between him and the creature. Ben took the opportunity to run back to the cockpit, grabbing the emergency radio that miraculously started working again. As he shouted for help, he felt the heat of the explosion spreading through the cargo hold and knew that the entire plane could explode at any moment. With what strength he had left, he opened the cockpit door and jumped into the snow outside, running as fast as he could to get away from the plane. The last thing he saw before the Arctic darkness swallowed him was the sight of the plane engulfed in flames, with the aurora borealis illuminating the sky above. He didn't know exactly what he had been transporting in that cargo, but he knew he had done everything he could to prevent it from escaping into the world. Now, all that was left was to wait and pray that help arrived before the extreme cold took over his body.